United States vehicle emission standards are set through a combination of legislative mandates enacted by Congress through Clean Air Act. These standards cover common motor vehicle air pollution, including carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate emissions, and newer versions have incorporated fuel economy standards. In nearly all cases, these agencies set standards that are expected to be met on a fleet-wide basis from automobile and other vehicle manufacturers, with states delegated to enforce those standards but not allowed to set stricter requirements. California has generally been the exception, having been granted a waiver and given allowance to set stricter standards as it had established its own via the California Air Resources Board prior to the 1970 CAA amendments. Several other states have since also gotten waivers to follow California's standards, which have also become a de facto standard for vehicle manufacturers to follow. Vehicle emission standards have generally been points of debate between the government, vehicle manufacturers, and environmental groups, and has become a point of political debate. The Clean Air Act of 1963, which gave the HUE Secretary authority to set federal standards for vehicle emissions as early as 1967. In the mid-20th century, as California economically grew after the Great Depression, the pollution in the state started to increase, generating a great deal of smog, particularly in the valleys of Southern California, making it difficult to breathe and harming crops in nearby areas. It was not until the 1960s that this smog was tied to emissions of carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides from inefficient fuel combustion from cars and factories by Ari Jan Hagen-Smit. Hagen-Smit found these air pollutants photoreacted with sunlight to form ozone, which contributed to the formation of the smog and caused the physiological effects on humans and plants. California established the California Air Resources Board in 1967, with Hagen-Smit as its first chairman, which among other activities set stringent vehicle emission standards by that year. Other states were also facing similar air pollution issues at the same time, but fearing that setting too strict a standard would drive away automobile manufacturers, they considered implementing standards that were less restrictive compared to California, potentially creating a patchwork of regulations across the United States. The automobile industry lobbied to Congress, and the CAA was modified in 1967 with the National Emission Standards Act that expressly prevented states from setting more restrictive emission standards than the federal levels. However, because California has already established its program, it was granted a waiver and allowed to keep its standards. This act did give states authority to perform vehicle inspections programs beyond the requirements for new vehicles, though few states took their own action on this. Air pollution has become a major national focal point by 1970, leading to a major amendment to the CAA. Near the end of 1970, the United States Environmental Protection Agency was formed out of an executive order under President Richard Nixon with ratification by Congress to consolidate all of the environmental-related executive branch programs to a single entity. The new agency was reflected as the primary agency for administering the CAA going forward. Among the provisions related to vehicle emissions, additionally, The 1970 CAA amendment continued California's waiver program through which California can seek exemptions from the EPA's emissions requirements as long as theirs are at least as strict as the EPA's vehicle standards. The EPA's assessment of the state of the country meeting the target NAAQS goals by 1975 was poor, having identified numerous non-attainment areas in the country. With the 1977 amendment to the CAA, a new deadline of December 31, 1982 for meeting the NAAQS was fixed with no allowance for extending the deadline unless specific control measures were established. Among other key provisions was the establishment of required vehicle inspection and maintenance programs in non-attainment states and optional in other areas. This required that states establish emission testing facilities for in-use vehicles to make sure they meet emissions requirements, maintained and repaired as necessary to correct any problems before their license was renewed. The EPA was tasked to establish the basic protocols for these facilities. Other states that had met the NAAQS attainment goals could optionally establish I/M programs for existing but were required to follow the EPA's specifications. Due to its pre-existing standards and particularly severe motor vehicle air pollution problems in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, the U.S. state of California has special dispensation from the federal government to promulgate its own automobile emissions standards. Other states may choose to follow either